Hello and welcome back. This is the week 7 lecture. So last week was all about summarizing. We talked about sort of our basic summary approach, our procedure. We had some steps that we could follow. We had sort of a basic organizational structure that we could follow. And hopefully we're pretty comfortable with summarizing by now. Maybe we started with some paragraphs, worked our way up to entire essays or articles, and hopefully by the end of last week you guys were able to write a good summary on one of your sources, an in-depth, really comprehensive summary that you might be able to use later if you do in fact stick with that source and if it becomes, a part of your research project eventually. So with all of that still in mind, this week we're going to jump into paraphrasing and quoting. Think of these as sort of parallel skills to go along with summarizing. We really want to do, ultimately, all of this stuff together, sort of simultaneously or in the same space. We're going to be summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting. Sometimes, again, we'll be sort of doing two at once. Sometimes we might do some summarizing followed by some more specific paraphrasing. And then maybe in the midst of that paraphrasing, we include a direct quote or two. So in the weeks to come, all of these skills will come together. We will utilize them oftentimes together, sort of at the same time, in the same place, working with our sources. So I want to start with paraphrasing because it is similar to summarizing, but a little bit different. And sometimes the terms are used interchangeably, which is a little inaccurate and misleading. I would think of summarizing and paraphrasing as cousins, not necessarily siblings, and certainly not identical twins. So they are not exactly alike, but they share certain things in common. So to just give you a basic definition for the term paraphrase, we can think of it as a restatement of a text's main ideas. So if we are reading a text, reading a potential source, some type of article or book chapter, we are often going to need to do this. And we've already been doing this to an extent with our summaries. We are restating what the source is saying. We are expressing the main ideas, the main points of the source using our own words, our own word choice, our own sentence structure, and all of that. So you might be thinking, well, isn't that the exact same as a summary? That sounds very much like what we were saying last week about summarizing. And that's true, but here's the difference. Here's what distinguishes a paraphrase from a summary. It's about length. So the basic principle is the same. You're taking the author's ideas and you are restating them, rephrasing them in your own words. That's true of a summary and of a paraphrase. But remember what else we said about the summary last week. We said when you are summarizing, that means you're condensing the original source text, right? You are shrinking it down. You are shortening it. You are really distilling it down to its essence. You are not mentioning everything that gets mentioned in the original source text, right? That's a big part of summarizing, is shrinking down. Remember, a good summary will be roughly 10% of the length of the original source text. So we know that. But a paraphrase will not be shorter than the original source text that you are paraphrasing. So you're changing the language. You're making the language your own, but you are not adjusting the length. You are not shortening anything, which means that you're not taking stuff out. That's a big part of summarizing is, to only hit the main ideas. You're taking out the stuff that's less than essential because you're presenting a shorter, more condensed version of the original. But with a paraphrase, you want the length to be roughly the same as what we see in the original. So you're not condensing, you're not shortening, taking stuff out, you're really just rephrasing. you're just restating, writing new sentences with new words, new organization, perhaps new sequence, in order for you to explain what the author of the source is saying. So because of the nature of the paraphrase, because it's roughly the same length as the original, it kind of goes without saying that we use paraphrase a little bit differently than we use summary. So like we've already seen, we can summarize an entire essay. We can summarize an entire source, no matter the length, right? Summary is built for tackling big chunks of text. And we can shorten it down, make it more manageable, create a new thing, which is our summary, makes that source easier to work with. So we can summarize anything. We can summarize an individual paragraph. We can summarize, a 25-page article. But when we're paraphrasing, we're going to make some different choices. We don't really want to paraphrase an entire source. I mean, if you have a short text, maybe you can do that. Typically, we don't do that. Because again, if you're going to paraphrase, a 10-page news article, your paraphrase is going to be roughly 10 pages. That's a lot of writing. That's obviously very time-consuming. We don't typically want to do that. So instead of paraphrasing the entire source, you will typically paraphrase some key passages, some key parts or sections of the larger source. And the amount is really up to you. Oftentimes we might paraphrase a sentence or two, and we will write a new sentence or two of our own, sort of explaining, rephrasing what that original source text is saying. In some cases, you might be able to paraphrase a short paragraph. You might even paraphrase a couple of paragraphs, but you wouldn't really go beyond that. You don't really need to paraphrase multiple pages of a source. Typically, that's really more of a situation for a summary. If you want to create a document that covers the entire source, that's a good time to summarize, right? But if you find a really compelling passage, a really interesting, important section of the text that's just really nailing some critical points that you think are going to be important for you and your research project, that's the sort of thing to paraphrase. A really powerful statement, a really good sentence, a couple of really good sentences. Those are good candidates for paraphrases because you don't really need to shorten them. They're already just, a sentence or two. So you're just translating. Remember, we've talked about this a lot. You're taking those ideas from the author's language and you are translating them into your own language that you can better understand. But just like a summary, you're not adding any opinions. You are not editorializing. You're not adding anything new. So that's important to remember. You're not taking stuff out like you would in a summary, but you're still not adding anything new. That's true of a summary and a paraphrase. If it's not in the text, if it's not being talked about in the source text, then you shouldn't be talking about it in your summary or paraphrase. That's what we mean when we say don't add anything new. Even if it feels harmless, like, oh, when I read this, it made me think of this other thing that I read 2 years ago, or this thing that happened to me the other day. We'll have a chance to do that kind of work later, but that shouldn't be in your paraphrase because you're talking about stuff outside the text. You're getting into other, maybe related areas, but areas that are not specifically connected to the text. They're not in the text. So everything you're talking about, everything you're saying should come from the text. But the language, the structure of your sentences, of course, all that will be your own. So typically paraphrases will be a little bit more detailed than summaries. You can do a little bit more close examination because you're not covering so much ground, right? You're not trying to shrink down an entire essay. You're just translating or explaining a couple of sentences or maybe a paragraph. And again, you're not taking out details, you're really sort of capturing everything that's there in that original passage. You're just putting it in your own words. And that's important to remember. You're putting it in your own words so you understand it better, and also so that your readers will understand it better. This is the real purpose of paraphrasing, more than anything else. I mean, it can serve multiple purposes, but the most important reason that we paraphrase is to explain or illustrate original source text, original source material that might be sort of complicated. It might be complex. It might just be unfamiliar. Remember, some of your sources, maybe not all, but some of your sources will be pretty sophisticated, difficult to understand, highly advanced in some ways, and even sources that aren't. Sources that might be easier to read, like a newspaper article. You have to remember your audience, the people you're writing for, they haven't read your sources. I'm a member of your audience. I have not read your sources. So even if it's a pretty straightforward newspaper article, right, there might be certain things in that article that I'm not going to understand because I haven't read the article. And see, this is why quoting only is not enough, especially if you're not explaining your quotes. A lot of times you can't just tell me what the author says, because if I haven't read the whole article and I'm just reading one thing the author says out of context, I'm not really going to understand it, right? Because I haven't read the rest of the article. It would make more sense if I had, but I haven't, and your readers have it. So we'll talk about this in a few minutes. Quoting has its place and it's valuable, but paraphrasing is a better way to take complex ideas and make them easier to understand. We can also do that when summarizing. This is one of the reasons we summarize too. We can take the stuff from the author's language, from the author's world, which might be foreign, strange, hard to understand for an audience, and we can translate those ideas, translate the language at least, put it in our own words, put it in a structure, in a form, in a tone that's going to be easier to understand, easier to see. And that's often what we're doing. We're using the paraphrasing tool in order to explain or illustrate something in our original source. So you have to understand this is a process, right? First, you work with the source on your own. You read it, you annotate it, you underline important passages, you summarize it. You arrive at an understanding of what the source is doing, what the source is saying. This might take a while, like we were saying last week. Sometimes it takes a while to read a source, to fully understand a source, and to summarize it. You might have to look some things up. You might have questions to answer. It could take several days. It could take a week, couple of weeks, whatever. But eventually, you'll get there. And you understand the source. And that's when you're ready to start doing this kind of work. That's when you're ready to start paraphrasing, quoting, and doing more with the source. But you really can't paraphrase, you can't do it successfully until you've reached your own understanding. So when you come to a passage that's important, when the author is saying something that you think is really important, you already know what the author is saying. You know what they mean. You've already done the work through your note-taking and your summary. You've already broken that down. You've put it into your own words. And when you paraphrase, you're just sort of doing that in a more concentrated, sort of specific manner. Again, instead of tackling that entire essay, you're trying to really explain sentences, paragraphs, really important ideas, stuff that you probably mentioned in a bigger summary. But now you can explain in more detail, right? Oftentimes the stuff the author is saying is going to be evidence. It's going to be an example. It's going to be an illustration of an abstract concept or a sort of difficult idea. And by explaining what they're saying, you're going to make the idea make sense. You're going to make the evidence make sense. You're going to make everything click into place for your reader. So it's hard to overstate how important it is to be able to summarize and paraphrase effectively. That's how you take the best info from your sources and make it work for you. But again, that means you have to put it in your own sentences and you have to explain what the hell they're talking about and make it clear and easy to understand for your audience. So one kind of helpful device for thinking about paraphrasing, it's kind of an old-fashioned thing. We used to teach this to younger students, but we would call it the 5 levels of paraphrase. Just sort of basic principles, things that you need to be doing when you are paraphrasing. And a lot of this can translate to a larger summary as well. We've covered some of this stuff, but I want to repeat some of it and add a few thoughts as well. Just basic tactics, basic moves to make when you are paraphrasing. So we've already talked about number 1, replacing certain words of the author with your own words. So we can call this, replacing words with synonyms or changing vocabulary, whatever you want to call it. We're just talking about individual words. But remember what I said before, it's never enough to just change individual words. So this is level 1. This is like the most obvious kind of surface level change that you can make to the text when you're paraphrasing. So it's nice and you need to do it, and you do want to choose your own words. Don't just use all of the words that the author used, because then you're not paraphrasing. But this is just the beginning, right? But this is where some of that translation can occur, and this is where you're simplifying a lot of things, right? It's often good to take a difficult word or an obscure word or a highly specialized word that might be specific to a particular discipline or academic field, right? A word that's not going to be familiar to everyone. And you can find a synonym, find a more familiar synonym for that word and use that instead. Not only are you changing something so you can make it your own, but you're also making life easier for yourself and for your readers by replacing that difficult word with a shorter, easier, more familiar word. So that's a good way to start. But then you want to move to level 2, which is changing sentence structure. Varying the sentence structure. So I've talked about this before. One of the biggest mistakes students make when they're trying to summarize or paraphrase is they'll cut and paste a big block of text, a big chunk of text from their source, put it into their doc, and they'll think, all right, I'm just going to do step 1, basically. I'm going to replace a few words, and then it won't be the exact same as it was in the source, and it will be fine. But it's not really, because you're not changing the sentence structure. So it still sounds a lot like the original from the author. Even though a few of the words are different, all of the sentences are arranged and structured in the same way. And really, even in some cases more than vocabulary, what creates tone, what creates style in a piece of writing is sentence structure, the way sentences sound. Long sentences, short sentences, the way phrases or clauses are arranged within sentences. That's usually what dictates what it sounds like. So if you're not changing the structure, you're just replacing a few words, then that text will still very much sound like the author. It's not going to sound like you. So you have to really create new sentences. If you want to completely change the structure, you just need brand new sentences written by you. So this sort of takes us to the next piece of this 5-level sort of progression, which is changing sentence, like turning long sentences into short sentences, or maybe taking a short sentence, making it a longer sentence, just making the structure and the individual sentence length your own. So again, that means rearranging stuff, reordering information. That's step 4. You're not going to present everything in the exact same order that the author did. Now again, you're going to present the same info. You're not taking info out if you're paraphrasing. You're not adding new info. But the actual sequencing or arrangement of certain facts or statements could be altered. if you find it necessary, if you think that's a way to sort of create something new. Your paraphrase needs to be something new. So it'll be new sentences with new words, presenting information perhaps in a slightly different order, right? And that would be very good. And then finally, the fifth level of paraphrasing in this kind of old configuration is very important to remember. We still are very much believe in this part. You are expressing abstract concepts more concretely. So if you guys know what it means, I think you sort of have a sense of the difference between something concrete, something tangible that we feel like we can sort of, wrap our arms around versus an abstract concept, which is sort of hard to define, can often be rather complex, somewhat theoretical, and that's often what we are doing with this kind of work. A lot of our sources are going to have a lot of abstract concepts. Theories, hypotheses, different things from science or philosophy or political science or economics or whatever field or branch you might be exploring. There's going to be a lot of theories, a lot of ideas. They're not concrete things that you can pick up and hold. They are ideas. They exist kind of on a more abstract level. And in some cases, they might be ideas that are not familiar to everybody. So you are taking those abstract, difficult concepts and you are making them more concrete. You are making them something tangible, something easier to understand, something more familiar, something that will be easier, again, for you to understand, but also for your readers to understand. And then just a final note, we always have to caution about this because it's so easy to slip up and fall into this. But remember, when you're paraphrasing, just like when you're summarizing, you are not reinterpreting the meaning of the text. You are not providing commentary on the meaning of the text, whether you agree or disagree. And you really don't want to infer any meaning from the text that is not explicitly found, not explicitly evident in the text. That's what I mean. You don't go outside the text. You don't talk about other stuff that's not in the text that you're summarizing or paraphrasing. So that includes your own ideas, your own thoughts, your own experiences, or things that other people said, right? Unless your author is talking about those other people. Okay, so you just have to catch yourself and make sure you're not straying sort of outside the lines. And remember what it means to infer. We talked about this a few weeks ago. We talked about the differences between an author stating something versus maybe implying something. And then we talked about inferring. And inferring is something that the reader does. The author does not really infer, and the text does not infer. The reader does. The reader, you, the person reading the source, you can infer things, sort of reach conclusions, educated guesses based on what you're reading, what you're seeing, what it says or means to you. But inferring is something that you are doing. It's not something that the author is doing. So when the author states things, you're talking about that. You're summarizing that, maybe paraphrasing that. If the author suggests or implies something, you can often summarize that or paraphrase that. But inferences are yours. Inferences come from outside the text. They come from your mind, okay? So they don't belong in a summary or a paraphrase. And you're also not commenting or agreeing with the meaning of the text or, like I said, reinterpreting it. Being like, maybe he actually means this other thing. Maybe there's a case to be made for it, but if it's not explicitly in the text, we don't need it here. Again, we'll have a chance later to analyze sources, spend more time evaluating sources, and we can do more of that speculative work and more opinion-based work when we get there. But for now, none of that really factors into a good paraphrase or a good summary. Okay, so I thought it might be helpful just to run through some examples to kind of hear and see what a good paraphrase looks like. So I posted one example into the week 7 module, and I want to just kind of look over it briefly. It's a little difficult to read. It's an old PDF. It looks like this. It's 2 columns of text, and we'll just look at that really quickly. But first, I would like to just read you guys a passage that I pulled from an academic journal article about literature, not super pertinent to our research projects, but just to give us an example of a paraphrase. Let me read this passage from an academic article. It's complicated. It's kind of hard to understand. So I'll read it first, okay? And then I'll read a paraphrase written by a student that does not really shorten the passage, does not take anything out, does not add any new material. It restates the ideas in a more straightforward, clear, simpler fashion. And so this is kind of what we want. Let's start with the source text. So again, this is from an academic article written not too long ago, maybe 10 years ago, about the famous novel Moby Dick. You don't need to know anything else, really. Just listen to the passage. You might be able to make some sense out of it, but you'll certainly notice the style, the tone, the level of difficulty, and then we'll turn to the paraphrase. From the beginning of the story, Melville's use of ambiguity compels the reader to consider the ramifications of language's mixed messages. The multiple meanings that words carry are constant reminders of the dangers of monistic thinking. Okay, so that's 2 sentences that I pulled from the academic journal article. They're important sentences. I've decided I want to do something with these sentences. The ideas being expressed here are very important to my understanding of the source, and there's something that might be connected to what I want to talk about in my later work. But the language here is difficult, okay? I want to paraphrase. I want to put it in my words so I can better work with it, all right? And one of the first things I would do, and did actually do, the first time I read this article, and what I had my students do when I had them read this article, was look up monism, which is a particular theory of philosophy that the author of the source is mentioning here. So just to give you a definition that you can find through Google, monism attributes oneness or singleness to a concept, such as existence. So this is a theory or doctrine that denies the existence of a distinction or duality between things. So it's kind of complicated, but they deny, for example, duality between what are the examples? They deny duality between matter and mind, between God and the world. It can also be considered a doctrine that only one supreme being exists. It's singleness, oneness, one supreme power, one supreme source of knowledge and existence, essentially, right? So I had to look it up because when I first read the article, I didn't know what that was. So I found a definition, wrote it down. Already I'm starting to put it in my own understanding, my own words. Okay? So now let's hear the paraphrase that can serve as a much better sort of version of this information because it's in a student's language. Now we can do more with it. But notice, I'm not shortening. I have 2 sentences just like in the original, okay? And the ideas are the same. So here's the paraphrase. Melville uses a sense of ambiguity throughout the story so that the reader will start to think about how confusing and contradictory language can be. A lot of the words in the story have more than one meaning, and this is supposed to remind us that only believing in one meaning or one single source of power can be dangerous. because that's what the author is saying. But notice, I'm changing a lot of the words. I'm not even talking about this theory of monism, right? Monism, maybe. I'm just dispensing with that term completely. I'm explaining it in my own language, but I don't need to use that obscure philosophical term that most people aren't going to recognize or be familiar with. Okay? So I'm simplifying the language. I'm also writing new sentences. A few of the words are the same. I'm not changing ambiguity, though I could find a synonym for it. But it's okay to use that same word. But the way I'm using it, the sentence in which I'm using it, is completely different. I'm reordering the words. I'm reordering the ideas. My sentence structure does not sound the same, does not look the same as what we see from the original source text. Also, I'm doing explaining, right? I'm explaining, I'm translating, I'm illustrating. That's what a paraphrase is supposed to do. So go back to the source text. The author says, Melville, who's of course the author of Moby Dick, wants the reader to consider the ramifications of language's mixed meanings. That's a mouthful. Look at how I've phrased that. The reader will start to think about how confusing and contradictory language can be. See, language's mixed meanings might not mean a lot to a reader who hasn't read that entire article about Moby Dick. It's going to make more sense if you've read the whole thing, but just taken as this one piece, this one passage, you might not really know what that means. What are the mixed messages, right? You don't really know, right? Because in this passage, the author isn't providing examples. The author isn't really explaining. See, this is one of the key things about paraphrasing. Oftentimes, an author of a source will not explain a concept because they assume that anybody reading their academic journal article knows a lot about the subject and already knows what they're talking about, right? So you may or may not. If you do already know, great. If you don't already know, you can do what I did and Google some stuff and figure it out. But when it's time for you to summarize and paraphrase, right, you have to be the mediator, the middleman between your audience who does not know your source and is not a specialist or an expert in the field of that's in the field that's being discussed in that source. So you're taking these complex ideas that aren't always explained in the source and you're making them easy to understand for your audience. So instead of talking about language's mixed meanings, which is kind of hard to understand, I say how confusing and contradictory language can be. Maybe a little bit easier. I'm getting a little bit more concrete. Language is confusing. Language can have contradictory meanings. So maybe that's a little bit more clear. And then I break down the philosophical theory that the author of the academic source assumes her audience will be familiar with. She doesn't explain it. She might have a citation or a footnote, but she's not offering an explanation. That falls to me to do in my paraphrase. So I dispense with that term, and I just talk about believing in oneness or singleness, and apparently there's some dangers attached to that. So I'm not changing the meaning. I'm not changing the ideas. I'm just making them a little bit easier to understand. So if we look at that other example, the one that I posted, just take a look at the original passage, and you can kind of read through it quickly. It's just a handful of sentences. It's about one paragraph, really. And then you'll notice the paraphrase, which is slightly longer, not significantly longer. We're not making a major alteration to length. Remember, the length should be roughly the same in a paraphrase, roughly the same as the original. But, as we heard before, sometimes we might need to replace a short sentence that's kind of hard to understand with a slightly longer sentence that offers more of an explanation. So we might add a few words, but only so that we can explain what the author is saying. Only so we can make it more clear to our audience. And that's really what we see in this example of a paraphrase. So let's start with the original passage. from our source, okay? Pretending this is one of our sources. So this is a piece about immigrating to a new land, a new country, okay? First sentence of the original passage. When you first arrive on these shores, you are in mourning. Okay, notice that sentence isn't super clear if you haven't read the entire source. Okay, if you don't really know the source and you only have a general idea of what the source is about, that first sentence doesn't really make sense because the author isn't explaining themselves in super clear terms. Why are we in mourning? First of all, they're using this kind of second person address. You are in mourning. Who's you? Why are you in mourning? Why are you sad? Why are you grieving? The author doesn't necessarily explain that. They assume their readers will know. But now when you're paraphrasing, you can't make that same assumption. Your readers haven't read the original source. They're not going to know what that first sentence is if you just quote it to them. They're going to be like, what? What does that mean? Well, I don't know what that means. So your paraphrase can be a little bit longer than that original short sentence if you're able to successfully explain the meaning of that original short sentence. So read the paraphrase version. The first sentence of our paraphrase is much more clear. New immigrants to America feel the loss of their friends, family, and culture. See, there's a level of specificity there. There's some specific examples there that we don't get in the original. We don't get from the original source text. So that's how we are explaining. That's how we're making the author's idea a little bit easier to understand. That's why we're in mourning. We have lost things as we've left one place to go to another. We've lost friends, family, and culture. Okay? So we're not changing the idea. We're not drastically changing the length, but we do end up with a slightly longer sentence because we're offering more of an explanation. Okay? So now let's go back to the original passage, the second sentence of the original. The only consolations are these products, which had been imbued with religious significance back at home. Again, taken out of context, if you haven't read the rest of Codrescu's original source article, you have no idea what they're talking about, right? What consolations? What does imbued mean? What has religious significance? What are they talking about? It's not clear. So again, that would not be a good sentence to quote. If you just throw that quote in, your readers, and that includes me, will be like, what? I don't know what that means. So, when you're paraphrasing, you need to explain what it means. So here's the paraphrase version. To console themselves, this again being the newly arrived immigrants, to console themselves, they turn to material objects, such as cars and furniture, things that they could not buy in the old country, but could only dream of possessing. Right? So again, our sentence now is a little bit longer than the original sentence that we're paraphrasing, but we're making it more specific. We're offering examples to really illustrate what the author is talking about. Right? So the author just mentions these products because again, the author of the source has probably mentioned the products earlier, on an earlier page, in an earlier paragraph, but we're not paraphrasing that part, right? We're paraphrasing this part. So we can't assume that our readers are going to know what this author was talking about 3 pages ago. They'll have no idea, right? So when the author says these products, well, you, because you've studied the source, you know what they're talking about, but your audience, the people you're writing for, will not know. Will have zero idea, right? So instead of just repeating these products or saying the products instead of these products and thinking, well, that's a different word, I'm good. Instead, don't say these products. Mention the products, material objects, such as cars and furniture. Be specific. You know that's what Codrescu means. You know it. right? So now your audience knows it because you're explaining it to them in your paraphrase, okay? And again, don't use a word like imbued. Most people don't know what that word means, right? That word is what your author is using. You don't need to use it. That's a great time to replace that word with a new word or just change the whole structure, right? So you can say material objects such as cars and furniture, things that they could not buy, but could only dream of possessing. That's what Codrescu means by imbued with religious significance. But if you just repeat that phrase, nobody's going to know what you're talking about unless they've read the same source document that you've read, right? So you're translating. That's why it's essential to change the language. Take these words that people don't know, these phrases that people aren't going to be familiar with, and these references to earlier things that the author said that aren't going to be clear out of context. Take all of that, change the language, explain it, and that's how you arrive at a good paraphrase. So let's just finish it up. The next sentence in the original, but when these things turn out not to be the real things, you begin to experience a second death brought about by betrayal. And it goes on about the religious significance. So again, that's going to be unclear. That's not a good candidate to quote. You need to explain it. You need to put it in your own words. So in the paraphrase, we get, the immigrant discovers, sadly, that the products are cheap and shoddily made. This discovery is a second loss. Earlier in the paraphrase, they explained the first loss. Our friends, our family, our culture. Now we have a second loss, which is losing hope, apparently, right? That's what Codrescu means. But our sentence makes that a lot more clear. So if you go through the two, if you really compare the two columns side by side, the ideas are the same. The basic meaning, the basic message of the text is the same. But in the paraphrase, we have a few extra lines, some extra words, just so we can be more clear and so we can fully explain. But look, the length is not that different. So we're not making major alterations, but in some cases, we can write slightly longer sentences. In other cases, we can take a long sentence and make it shorter. We can go both ways. Taking short sentences, making them longer and more detailed, and then taking long, really complicated sentences and maybe simplifying them, making them more clear. Both are fair game when you're paraphrasing. So, kind of take this example, use it to kind of guide you a little bit as you start doing this type of work. Okay, so now let's talk about direct quotations, because we definitely want to possess this skill as well. This is another good thing to have on our tool belt. But again, we don't want to be overly reliant on direct quotes, because it's an easy thing to see when a student has not really dealt with a source, when a student has not really taken the time to read and, annotate and summarize a source. One of the best ways to kind of tell is they will just quote it all the time without really explaining much, without putting much into their own words. They will just throw long quote after long quote into their paper in the hopes that it kind of looks like they've done good source work. But really, that doesn't really prove effective at all, because if you just string together a bunch of quotes, those quotes are rarely doing good work for your audience. So we not only need to think about what a quote is, I think we already pretty much know that, we need to think about the right times and the right reasons to quote. All right, so as we know, a direct quotation is using the author's exact words. So you're putting the words in quotation marks now. This is obviously very different from summarizing or paraphrasing. Now, when you're quoting, the words are not yours. And any time the words and the sentences are not yours, you have to put them in quotation marks. You guys know that that's not optional. That is mandatory. Your readers have to be able to tell the difference between your language, what you're saying, versus the direct quotations that are coming from straight from the author's mouth. So anytime you find a statement, a sentence, a phrase, maybe even an individual word, and you just feel like the author is saying it better than you can, that might be a good time to quote. Or if the sentence is just really punchy, really compelling, really gripping, sort of exciting or dynamic in some way. Or if the sentence just makes it really clear exactly what the author is saying. If it's memorable, if it really sticks in the mind, then that might be a good thing to quote. But the litmus test, the way you should always judge it, you should always ask yourself, could I express that idea better or as well as the author is? And it's not about a competition so much. Again, it's more about understanding that you have an audience. Your audience is, peers, me, anybody who might read your work. And understanding that in a lot of cases, like you're only going to want to quote if the author is just doing something that you can't do, right? They're saying it in a way that you can't improve upon. You can't really replicate that in your own language using your own structure. So it should be kind of a high threshold. Like if you feel like it's a good idea, but the way the author is expressing it is kind of confusing or difficult or boring, you should always summarize or paraphrase in those instances. If you feel like you can just make it more clear, easier, simpler, you can make it sort of land better with your readers, then really summarizing or paraphrasing would be best. But if it sounds great in the source and you just don't think you can improve upon it, then it might be a good thing to quote. Also, if it's somebody's firsthand testimony, if it's really powerful eyewitness accounts, like some of that stuff's worth quoting, right? It's not going to sound as good or as powerful in a paraphrase, right? You might really want to capture the language of the person speaking. There's going to be cases of that. And when that happens, yeah, you definitely want to quote. Some other reasons to quote. Oftentimes it can be good support, right? Once we start making arguments of our own in our research projects, you might find some quotes from experts or other valuable testimonials that you can bring in as evidence supporting ideas or statements of your own. So, again, we often use experts for this, use expert opinion. Sometimes we like to quote them, especially if they are agreeing with us, and we can use that as evidence. Also, and this is when we're kind of in a specialized area where there's a lot of jargon or like technical language. This is going to be true of certain disciplines or fields of study, like computer programming, right? Like there's certain terms that, have a particular meaning in that world, and they might not really get used a lot in other places or in other contexts. So those kinds of words, it can sometimes be hard to find synonyms for them. If they are specific to a job, if they are specific to an academic discipline, a branch of science or whatever, psychology, right? Might be hard to find synonyms for those. So in some cases, if you have terms or particular words that are very specialized or technical, you might just need to use those words. And in some cases, you're quoting them. And then once you've quoted them, you might just be able to use them as part of your own vocabulary because you become knowledgeable about that field as well. But also just really vivid language. Again, like I was saying, if it's powerful, memorable, makes a strong impression, and you just can't say it any better, then that's a good time to quote. And then finally, sometimes if you want to respond to an opponent, if you want to respond to a source or to a particular viewpoint or perspective because you are disagreeing or you're engaging with it in some way, then it might be good to quote the opponent or the person that you are responding to, so you can't be accused of taking their words out of context or, not really doing their words justice. You can actually quote them and then respond to the exact language in that quote. That could be a good way to boost your credibility and kind of show, hey, I'm being faithful to what they say. I'm not, being biased and putting it all into my own words, although that's a good thing to do too. But by quoting them, you're showing, hey, these are their words. Like, I'm not doing anything to it. This is the unvarnished quote. Then you can respond. It gives you something to do, gives you something to potentially refute or push back on, but you can also agree with it. You can also add something to it. You can also find a compromise with it. You can do anything. It gives you a chance to respond or make your next move, whatever that might be. And sometimes it's good to quote to help you do that, to set that up. Now, quoting's good. If we're using good judgment, we're going to pick good quotes and we're going to use them at good times. But there's some stuff to pay attention to with punctuation and formatting when you are quoting. And I want to go through this stuff. We'll kind of return to it throughout the semester. I can comment on some of these things, on your actual work. But we have to remember that a direct quotation has several moving parts, okay? We have to be a little bit careful and thorough when we are doing these because it's easy to make mistakes. It's easy to get a little bit sloppy with direct quotes if we're moving too fast or if we're not paying attention to what we're doing. So I'm also going to introduce a concept known as the quote sandwich today because this is a great way to think about organizing your direct quotes, to think about how you're going to package them and present them in your work. Because, again, if you're not thinking about this, your quotes are going to have a lot of errors in them, which can end up hurting you and taking away from your meaning, taking away from, your larger purpose. So the basic formulation here, the formula that we want to think about with a direct quote consists of the following things, okay? First, the introduction to the quote. So when we think about the quote sandwich, the intro to the quote is the top slice of bread. And a lot of students skip over this, but it's really important. Before we get to your direct quote that you're pulling from whatever source, you need to introduce it, okay? You need to get your readers ready for it. If you fail to introduce your quote, you end up creating what a lot of comp instructors will jokingly refer to as a quote bomb, which means you are just dropping the quote into your paper with no warning, no explanation, no context. You're just dropping it in. Here it comes. Here's a quote, okay? And when you do it that way, it can be a little bit bewildering. It can be a little bit jarring for the reader because a lot of times, like I've been saying, without an explanation from you, without some more detail, a lot of quotes aren't really going to make sense to your readers, right? A lot of these quotes that make sense to you because you've read the source and taken notes and summarized it, they're not going to make sense to your readers. So we want to avoid quote bombs. And the first part of doing that is creating good introductions to our direct quotes. Okay? And the introductions are pretty practical. In a lot of ways, you're just establishing who's talking, right? Like who's, providing the quote. You can identify the author by name. Okay, you can also refer back to the name of the source, the title of the source, but often you're simply identifying the speaker, kind of reminding us where this quote is coming from, right? And you can also include a little bit more info, but really, this can be as simple as she says, and then you get to the quote, or as Lackey states, comma. Right? That's an introductory phrase that gets us ready for the quote. It's a short phrase, it's easy, but it does a lot of work. It identifies who's speaking, Lackey in this case being one of your sources. It identifies the speaker, it starts the sentence in a grammatically correct way, and it clearly signals to your readers that you're about to provide a quote. Okay? So don't overthink the top slice of bread. These introductions can be very, very simple, very short. They're mostly just going to contain the author's name and some kind of a verb. Remember those signal verbs that I talked about last week when we were summarizing? Well, we can use a lot of those when we're quoting as well. She says, he claims, they refute, Lackey questions. Right? That can be your top slice of bread. That can be your introduction to the quote. Lackey questions that position. Now we're into the quote. She says, now we're into the quote. Simple, but necessary. So the introduction is the top slice of bread. Next up, we have the quote itself. So think of that like the meat of the sandwich, okay? The quote is the featured attraction, all right? Everything else is sort of there to support the quote. So obviously, when you're quoting, you want to get it right. Make sure you're getting the author's words correct. And make sure you're putting all of the author's words in quotation marks. I know that seems obvious, but it's easy to make a mistake if you're working fast. If you're not paying attention, we often forget to close our quote marks. I see that a lot. We'll start a quote, and then we end it like we mean to end it, and we go back to our own voice, but we just forget to include those closing quote marks. So that can be a major problem for such a minor thing. Such a small oversight can potentially lead to problems. So anytime you're quoting, you always want to go back and double check later when we are revising and editing. Make sure, do I have all my quotation marks in order, in the right places? And then after the quote, right after the quote, you're going to have a parenthetical citation, also known as an in-text citation. So remember, we have the two levels of MLA citation rules, the one level being the works cited page, or like a bibliography at the end of the paper, and then the other level is within the paper. Inside the paper, we have parenthetical citations or in-text citations that come right after direct quotes or summaries or paraphrases. This is a big thing that we're going to have to embrace over the next several weeks. Whenever we do this kind of work, the kind of work we've been talking about since last week, whenever we summarize, paraphrase, or quote, we have to provide in-text citations or parenthetical citations, which means they come inside parentheses. And they usually just include the last name of the author and a page number. If you don't have a page number, just the last name of the author. If you don't have an author, it can be an abbreviated version of the title of the source. It doesn't really matter. You always have an option for what you can put inside the parentheses. But you have to put something to show where this direct quote comes from. Even if it's a summary, even if it's a paraphrase, and it's your own words. At the end of that summary or paraphrase, you still need the in-text citation, right? Because the language is yours in a summary or a paraphrase, so you don't need to quote anything. You're not using quotation marks. But remember, the ideas are not yours. The ideas are coming from the author. So you still have to cite the author, whether the words are yours or not. Right? So if you're quoting, you're both providing quotation marks and an in-text citation. If you're summarizing or paraphrasing, you just need the in-text citation. But like I was saying earlier, sometimes we're doing all of this kind of at once, right? We might have a lengthy paraphrase that includes, in the middle of it, a direct quotation. Okay, so we might end up with a couple of in-text citations by the end of that paraphrase, just to make it clear that this is coming from the source, right? So we'll be talking about that a lot. I don't expect it to come naturally to you guys, but eventually, over the next few weeks, we have to get comfortable with in-text citations, and we must be sure that we are using them correctly. So when we're quoting, this is always going to be right after our ending quote marks. So once the quotation ends, we're probably going to start wrapping up that sentence pretty soon. So for a nice, clean structure, it's usually nice to go ahead and end the sentence with the end of the quote, unless it's a really short quote. If it's a quote of just like a word or two, it might just go in the middle of a sentence. But if we're going to quote an entire statement, if we're going to quote an entire sentence from our source, then we're going to introduce it. And then once that quote is over, we're going to go ahead and end that first sentence. We end our quote marks. Then we have our parenthetical citation. You can see the examples I posted in the week 7 module. And then after the parentheses, we have the period that ends the sentence. Remember, the ending quote marks and the parentheses with the citation, that all comes before the period, because that's all part of your sentence. The sentence is not over until the end of the in-text citation. So after the parentheses, you have your period, and then you start a new sentence. This is normally how a quote sandwich will look. And the next part of the formula is to finish the sandwich. So you need your bottom slice of bread after the quote and after the citation. And the bottom slice of bread is the explanation of the quote. What does that really mean? You're either explaining it or you are sort of following up on it. So if you feel like the quote is a bit hard to understand, if it's a bit complex, then you can explain some of what it's saying, right? Some of the meaning. But more often than not, you're not so much explaining exactly what the quote means, but you're more like putting the quote in its proper context, helping the audience to fully grasp it, and not just to grasp what it means, but also why it's important, why it matters to the author of your source, and also why it matters to you in your research project. So in some cases, we are explaining our quotes a little bit, but again, if it's really hard to understand, you should probably be paraphrasing it or summarizing it so you can simplify. So typically, if we're quoting, not a ton of explanation will have to come in, but it's more about really explaining what the significance of the quote is, right? Why does this quote matter? What are we going to do with the quote? And yeah, there can be some explaining along the way, but it's more about doing something active with the quote, making the quote work for you, allowing you to explain a larger point, a larger concept. Is it supporting one of your ideas? Is it going to allow you to make the next move that you want to make in your paper? That's ultimately kind of how we're going to be using these quotes, right? They're never just there to be there. They're never there in your paper just to take up space. They need to do something for you. They need to advance your argument, like we were saying. They might be support for your argument. They might represent the opposing viewpoint that you want to push back on. They might just be a good example that you want to show your audience because it's going to help them to understand. It's going to illustrate some key point. But that quote always needs to do something for you. Okay? Now, I've also included in the Week 7 overview the basic punctuation rules that go along with direct quotations. So I'm not going to read through all of this. I would really like you guys to look at the overview. I'm showing you examples. I'm talking about the difference between separated quotations and integrated quotations. I don't really need you guys to necessarily memorize those definitions. I just need you to understand the basic punctuation rules that we need to use when doing direct quotes. So I've listed these and tried to make these as simple as possible. So think of it this way. When you're going to make a quote sandwich, right, with your intro to the quote, your citation, and then the follow-up or the explanation of the quote, right, whenever you're going to write one of those, you kind of have three basic options when it comes to how you're going to write your top slice of bread and how you're going to punctuate. Okay, so option number one is using just a standard introductory phrase as your top slice of bread. And after the introductory phrase, you need a comma. Okay, so these can be very simple, like we saw. She says, as Lackey points out. With short phrases like that, you'll just need a comma after the phrase. As Lackey points out, comma. Then we start our quotation. Then we have our opening quote marks. Then we have the entire direct quote. Then we have our closing quote marks, right? Then we have our citation. Then we end that sentence. Okay? So that's very simple. Introductory phrase followed by a comma followed by the quote. That's option number one. Option number two, using an introductory sentence. Okay? So in some cases, we want a little bit more of a detailed intro. We want a little bit more than just a brief phrase. So something like, Lackey makes a strong rebuttal near the end of his article. See, that's a complete sentence. That's not just a phrase. So now I'm introducing the quote with a complete sentence that includes a little bit more detail, a little bit more context. Even something like X disagrees in her, third paragraph, right? Any complete thought, any complete sentence. The main argument becomes clear when she states, her three key priorities in the last paragraph, right? Anything like that, that's just a more detailed intro. If it is a complete sentence, and you have to verify that. Is it a complete sentence? Does it have a subject and a verb? Does it express a complete thought? If so, and you want to use it as your top slice of bread, that's great. But the punctuation's going to change, okay? With a complete sentence as the intro to the quote, you need a colon. That's the two dots, not the dot, not the period and the comma. That's a semicolon. But the two periods, arranged vertically, that's a colon. That's what you need if you're using a complete sentence as your introduction, as your top slice of bread. So it's going to be a little bit longer, right? A complete sentence has a little bit more to it. So a comma is not strong enough. You should think of punctuation as as possessing different strength levels. That can sometimes simplify. A comma isn't strong enough to handle a complete sentence all by itself. It can handle a phrase, a brief phrase, right? So if you have a brief introductory phrase, all you need is a comma. But if you have that complete sentence, you need a stronger punctuation sign, and that will be a colon. So you have your introductory sentence. Lackey disagrees when he points out his key priorities in the final paragraph. Colon, quote, followed by the quote. Okay? And the rest of it will look the same. And then your third option is to use, this is technically what's called an integrated quote, meaning you don't have any punctuation separating the quote from the rest of your sentence. Okay? You don't have to remember integrated versus separated. Just remember that this third option does not include punctuation. So you have to use slightly different word choice. So for the third option, you can use an introductory phrase or an introductory sentence that ends with a word like that, or to, or in some cases by, or in. Just that slight alteration of word choice makes the punctuation unnecessary. So that's what we mean when it's integrated, not separated. Now, there's no comma or colon between the quote and your top slice of bread. So an example would be, X agrees with Lackey when she writes that, or when she says that. So the word that takes us right into the quote, and we don't need a comma. We don't need a colon after the word that. If it's a seamless integration, Lackey agrees when he says that the earth is round. When it's seamless and that word that connects the quote directly to our introductory top slice of bread, then we've achieved an integrated quotation and we don't need any punctuation between our intro and our quote. But again, that's going to be about how you end your introductory phrase or sentence. If you end it with a word like to, or that, or by, or in, usually that is the key. And if that's the way you're leading into your quote, you just don't have to worry about the punctuation. But again, review those punctuation rules. Try to be as smooth and as clean with your direct quotations as possible, okay? And be judicious with your selection. When they're good, they work really well. When they're not clear, or when there's too many of them, the direct quotes don't work as well. So ultimately, we want to have a nice balance between summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting. And the last thing I'll say is just, a couple of things. There is a document with sample quote sandwiches. Okay, so again, the way I'm often showing it to you guys is I'm giving you different phrases and sentences that you can use for your top slice of bread. And then I'm giving you ways to start your next sentence after the quote, and that's your bottom slice of bread. So again, we're usually starting new sentences, right? After the quote ends, after the citation, we start a new sentence where we follow up on the quote or we explain it a little bit more. That's our bottom slice. So I'm showing you guys examples of both slices so you can start building quote sandwiches of your own, and you can certainly use some of my phrases, some of my sentences. Okay, so take a look at that document. You can use that later, and then start thinking about our next major assignment, which is the literature review, which is basically a big summary of several of your sources, and you'll be paraphrasing and quoting within that summary. So we're going to have a chance to showcase these skills soon. So we'll keep practicing, but then next week we're going to start working on the big lit review. So let me know if you have questions, and I will see you next week.